Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. And before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I know I only have 15 minutes. I hope you can hear me well. When I was asked about this talk, so many things one could talk about, especially living here in Gibraltar. And one, obviously, you'd say, well, let's make it something upbeat, something nice, something maybe people. But this is something, and Julian said, pick something that also reflects on you. This is something that has been bothering me a bit, so I thought I'd share it with you. So I'm calling it a question worth thinking about. And when we look at Gibraltar, Gibraltar really, we can use it as a surrogate microcosm, really. In many ways, microcosm or surrogate for the broader world. In many ways, because of our scale, a lot of things which might be buffered, take longer to affect the wider world, will affect us sooner. Think about the costs of maybe paying for our utilities, etc. These are issues of scale which have to do because of our small size. So I'm going to talk about one of them. And I want to ask you first, what's the population of Gibraltar? Anyone can tell me? 30,000. That's good. Well done, straight away. Okay, approximately 30,000. Now, it's great that if you were in a school and you ask this, different sectors of the population, any part of the world, will give you different sizes because it's been growing. But this has been pretty much there for a long time. So, I mean, it's been 30,000 for a while. I mean, we've cracked it. I don't know if that graph is very clear, but we are pretty much flatlining compared to a number of other small communities. I mean, we've cracked the world population problem. Our economy is growing really well, and our population is almost at zero growth. That would be brilliant. Whether it's true or not is something we'll come afterwards. Now, this is something, and I make no apologies for this because I borrowed heavily from the notes of this gentleman, Professor Albert Bartlett. If you take something away from this, go afterwards and Google him up. And he's got a lovely lecture entitled, "The Greatest Shortcoming of the Human Race is Our Inability to Understand the Exponential Function." Now, if I had that as a lecture when I was in university, I'd probably try and miss it because it sounds really boring. But it is absolutely great. Now, what is an exponential function? I mean, would you know one if it bit you? Well, it really is only used to describe something which grows steadily over time. And it might have bitten some of you because it's a percentage growth increase on what you pay in your credit card bill. It's what the cost of living goes up every year. These things, these continuous, constant little bits that add on and add on to themselves in a cyclical manner, which is what an exponential function is. Why is that interesting? Because population pretty much works in that way. What does it look like? Well, there's a story, and I thought I'd share it with you. You might know it. Some people say it's in India. I'm going to base it in China. But essentially, the Emperor of China found out about the game of chess. He said, "This is really cool. Who invented this?" And they bought this farmer who was the chap that invented the game of chess. "This is really brilliant. I want to reward you with something. What can I give you?" And this chap put a grain of rice on the first square. I don't think you can quite see that, but you can see 2 appear on the second, and then 4 appear on the third, 8 on the fourth. So he was just doubling the number of grains of rice. So, you know, the emperor said, "Well, this is cool. I'll just give him a couple of bags of rice, or maybe even shed loads of rice." This is what it actually looks like as it keeps on doubling. Look at what it does at the end. It really takes a while to warm up. But if anyone's got a credit card bill, you realize how quickly it starts piling up after a while if you don't pay it. It really does start to shoot up. That is the number of grains of rice after only half the chessboard is filled. If it had managed to fill the whole chessboard, you would have had something in the order of 18 quintillion grains of rice, which is 18 with 18 zeros behind it, and you would need a field twice the size of the planet Earth to grow it on, including the oceans. So this is what an exponential function does. And if you can ignore the third column because that one is more for mathematically, I suppose, oriented people. But the first one, this just explains what's happening. In the first square, there's 1 grain of rice, and at the end. In the second square, it doubles 2 grains of rice, and the total number of grains now becomes 3. In the third square, there's 4 grains of rice, the total number of grains now becomes 7. If you look across, you'll notice that on every next square, the total number of grains is always larger than everything that came before. Now, this is interesting. The last time the population of the world was half what it is now was when men were on the moon, 6869 roughly. There's been more people on the planet since then than there have been from that date back to the dawn of civilization and time. That's a staggering statistic when you think about it. That's how it works. And you notice when you compare it to a couple of other sort of curves, how it starts off quite small, quite low, but it really kicks up at the beginning. And you notice it actually crosses over towards the end. This crossing over was actually predicted by a chap called Malthus in the 18th century, late 18th century. And it's worth also looking at him. He was warning of these dangers of population rise. And he actually said, because of the way it grows eventually, there'll be more people than resources to actually sustain them. That's the graph of the world population growth now. And you'll see the similarity. It is an exponential curve. Look at what it's doing. Look at how it's gone up. World wars, famines, it's still there. These are just little blips if you look at the detail, but the general trend, that's where we're going. And that's where we are. 7 billion plus at the moment. At current rates of growth, in about 600 years, we'll have 1 person per square meter. This was a cartoon, and the gentleman in the middle is us telling the other one on the side, excuse me, I'd like to make you a very nice offer for your square. Now, this won't get to happen because other things will kick in to stop it happening. I think really what I'm ultimately getting at is we need to really start to consider what things we need to do to stop it happening, because otherwise those things will be decided for us. How does this doubling work out? And it's really very simple. Magic number of 70, I won't go into why, but if you just get 17, you divide it by this percentage increase that you have, you get the time it takes for something to double. So just to give you an example, if I put £1 in my bank account at 7% interest, do you know a bank that pays 7%? I'd love to. But put in a 7% interest, in 10 years, I'll have £2. It'll double in 10 years. That's what 7% means. But when we hear a percentage like that, we tend not to think. If you say, for example, oh, the prison population, it's actually, I don't know, gone up 7% every year for the last 10 years, you might not think much about it. If you said, well, the prison population in Gibraltar has doubled in the last 10 years, oh my God, what's happening? So sometimes when people say statistics don't lie. It's the way that the same amount of information is actually presented. We tend to not realize this growth that's hidden behind these relatively small numbers. So I'm going to give you a thought experiment. Let's imagine a bathtub, and I'm going to talk about not bacterial cultures, but cultured bacteria, because I need them to be thinkers also. So in this bathtub, I'm going to put 1 bacteria, these are my basic premises, right? At the first second of the start of a new year. And I have 1 year to do this experiment in. Okay, so put my little bacteria in the middle there. There's plenty of food. And each bacteria replicates, so they just basically become 2 every minute. So they're happily growing in the bathtub. Yeah? And these bacteria actually evolve. They actually become cultured. They actually start to have some sort of environmental awareness. They have their mobile phones and everything. They're quite intelligent bacteria in this bathtub. And as this thing grows, right, at a cocktail party, you can see there in the corner, they're realizing that in 1 year's time, the tub is going to be full. We've got a problem. So there's 2 sort of like, quite scientific bacteria having a chat at a cocktail party. The bath is half full now. We really ought to start thinking about maybe controlling this a little bit because, we've already used up half the bath. Now, my question to you is, at what time during this year would they be asking that question? Anyone want to hazard a guess? 3/4, that's good. Any others? Halfway. The 3/4 is closer. Quarter. Okay, let me tell you. 1 minute before New Year's Eve, it's doubling. If the bath is half full and you've already got that rate of population growth, by the time you're starting to talk about it, you're already running up against this wall which you haven't seen yet. So, with an exponentially growing population, when do you realize you have a problem? I mean, if you look at those 5 last minutes before New Year's Eve, 5 minutes before New Year's Eve, they've only used 3% of the bath. You have 97% of space that you can build on and grow and do stuff. And you're already in a big problem. But you can't see it. So let's bring it to Gibraltar. You have the population of Gibraltar growing. That's some work I did a few years ago. The one that's growing the most, just because of actual numbers that came in, particularly in the 18th century, is the Roman Catholic community. Not necessarily because they have more kids, but nevertheless, it gives you an idea that this is not flatlining. This is actually going up steadily. And if you look at that graph accumulated, you can actually see there is a growth. Last time I worked it out, it was in the region of 1.32%. Doesn't sound very much. Why do we all say 30,000 before? Because of this. It's being masked. It's being masked here in Gibraltar, particularly by the leaving, especially of MOD personnel, etc. The effects on the community are being masked because buildings are suddenly coming and becoming available and people can move into them. But that is running out. And the drop in people leaving on the surfaces is also pretty much going to taper out to nothing. So at 1.32%, what would be the doubling time for Gibraltar's population? Any ideas? Not very big. 53 years. In 53 years, at this rate of growth, without the hike that will come in after the MOD levels off, we'd have 60,000 people in Gibraltar. And I thought that's something worth thinking about. We have a form of quantitative easing, I suppose, which is our reclamation, but the reality is, if you had a bathtub again, and imagine that they actually find 3 new bathtubs, they'd fill it up in just 2 more minutes. Right? The full bathtub becomes 2, the 2 become 4. So in the 1980s, we had a reclamation, a third extra space. We filled it up in under 20 years. A third more than we had before. That had taken the whole of about 1,000 years to get there. So as I said, I think that's maybe something we should be thinking about. Thank you. Okay.